Death exists, not as the opposite, but as a part of life. This quote from Haruki Murakami's 1987 novel Norwegian Wood feels uncomfortable to read in 2020. As we continue to hold world powers accountable to prevent the continued spread of a deadly virus, discussions of mortality feel present and real. This was on my mind last week when I flew back to the United States for a brief visit. Aside from keeping myself safe, I have been forced to confront the inevitability of mortality through the declining health of a family member. As soon as I touched down, I was also reminded of the time of year. As someone who grew up in the US, I shouldn't be surprised by October. Shops are flooded with orange and black overlays, pumpkin-themed drinks are everywhere, and skeletons and ghosts begin popping up as reminders of the impending holiday of Halloween. But this year feels different. Watching skeletons dance around while also seeing others ignore difficult conversations feels like an uncomfortable juxtaposition. Though it might feel like there's a disconnect between Halloween imagery and mortality in US American culture, there doesn't have to be. In fact, the lighthearted images that we're used to actually have a history of not ignoring mortality, but embracing it. As you might imagine from the fact that you're watching this channel, Disney music has something to do with it. Let's talk about the Danse macabre and the history behind a certain Disney cartoon that was even banned in Denmark.
Fun to be free, to be on the move, to go for a hike or whatever you like to do. To all there is to be done. It's fun, it's fun, it's fun to be free, fun to be free.
In 1928, Walt Disney was on his way to New York City to sign a new distribution deal for the Mickey Mouse cartoons and to also record the score to his then new short, Steamboat Willie. On his way there, he made a pit stop in Kansas City to visit Carl Stalling, an old friend who was an organist and improviser. Disney would convince Stalling to compose scores for two already released silent shorts, specifically Plain Crazy and The Galloping Gaucho, making him an influential composer who defined characteristics of the Disney sound. According to Stalling, he had never formally composed before this collaboration, though his experience with improvisation can be counted as a form of composition. During this pit stop visit, Stalling reportedly proposed the idea of a series of shorts that revolved around music, eventually beginning what would be later referred to as the Silly Symphonies. The Silly Symphonies series was essential for building the relationship between Disney cartoons and music. Each short featured a score that dictated the narrative, both influencing how the music interacted with the animation and how the animation interacted with the music. For a name or title for the series, I suggested not using the word music or musical, as it sounded too commonplace, but to use the word symphony together with the humorous word. At the next gag meeting, I don't know who suggested it, but Walt asked me, "Carl, how would Silly Symphony sound to you?" I said, "Perfect." In order to find a narrative for the shorts, Stalling would begin by playing music that could set the mood. After a suitable tone was found, Disney would encourage Stalling to avoid using music that was under copyright and therefore would need to be purchased. Walt never wanted to pay for music. He wanted me to just make up something. In one picture, he wanted to use the song School Days, but he would have had to pay for it. So he said, "Carl, can't you write something that sounds like School Days, but isn't?" In the same meeting in which the name Silly Symphonies was decided upon, Stalling would also suggest the idea for the first short, a fanciful, lighthearted skeleton dance in a graveyard. From Stalling's perspective, the idea for the short came from his childhood. As a child, he had always been interested in spooky imagery, and specifically skeleton dancing acts in vaudeville performance. When I was 8 or 10 years old, I saw an ad in the American Boy magazine of a dancing skeleton, and I got my dad to give me a quarter so I could send for it. It turned out to be a pasteboard cutout of a loose-jointed skeleton, slung over a 6-foot cord under the armpits. It would quote-unquote dance when kids pulled and jerked at each end of the string. As you might imagine, it's not too far of a leap to go from a dancing cutout to an animated sequence of dancing skeletons. Distributed by Columbia Pictures, the skeleton dance was released on August 22nd, 1929, marking the beginning of the Silly Symphonies series. Unfortunately, the film had a rough opening night with a small audience. This angered Walt, with him reportedly asking Stalling, "What the hell's the matter with the damned thing?" After shipping the film off to New York City, the skeleton dance would receive acclaim after a run at the Roxy Theater, with the Film Daily saying that it was one of the most novel cartoon subjects ever shown on the screen. However, this did not mean that everyone appreciated the short. In fact, according to the New York Times, the short was even banned in Denmark for being quote-unquote too macabre. But why? What do they even mean by too macabre? Well, for starters, let's define macabre. According to Merriam-Webster, macabre means having death as a subject, comprising or including a personalized representation of death. In addition to this, different cultures have different interpretations of how death is appropriately portrayed within media. Another example under the Disney umbrella is the lack of a traditional haunted mansion at the Chinese theme parks. Though there is Mystic Manor at Hong Kong Disneyland, it's different than the Haunted Mansion, focusing less on ghosts and campy portrayals of spirits and instead on a mystical, enchanted music box. This is because, to put it simply, mainstream Chinese society has a different attitude towards ghosts than the US does, and therefore it's more fitting to treat the subject with more respect. So it doesn't surprise me that not everyone sees the same light-hearted, vaudeville-influenced fun that the skeleton dance celebrates. However, despite the inspiration for the short coming from Stalin's childhood, the imagery of skeletons dancing through a graveyard does play into a much older tradition called the Danse macabre. As a French phrase literally translating to the dance of death, Danse macabre is an artistic tradition from medieval Europe that depicts death as a celebratory occasion. It may seem a bit edgy and gruesome, but it was often done as a way of reminding others that death is something that everyone will eventually have to confront. Though there are divides in the physical world, nobody can escape death. According to Ashby Kinch, Danse macabre originated from a mural painted sometime between August 1424 and Lent 1425 by an anonymous artist. Situated on the outer wall of the now destroyed Holy Innocents Cemetery in medieval Paris, the painting depicted decaying corpses dancing amidst typological representations of late medieval society. A pope, an emperor, a bishop, a king, a monk, a minstrel, and many more. 30 figures in all, ambling diffidently while the corpses frolic and mock them, with jeering expressions, piercing remarks, and aping grotesque movements of their bodies, beautifully baroque and accentuated by stark contrasts of flesh and painted costume. The alternation between dead and living creatures creates a rhythm of animation and stillness, of white and color, a visual rhythm evocative of human culture itself. A new sense of community is achieved in and through the form, as the living face up to the dead, through whom they come to know concretely the abstraction of death. The social body is depicted in many of the murals as fluid and continuous, bound together by a common destiny that is reinforced by the imagery of dance. By portraying death as a dance, this mural acknowledged the inevitability of mortality while maintaining a light-hearted tone about making the most of life while one is still alive. Similar imagery began spreading through multiple European countries such as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland, among many others. Since then, the idea of the Danse macabre, also just referred to as the Dance of Death, has become a mainstay in many artistic depictions of mortality. This is why it's so interesting to me that Disney would eventually adopt the same imagery in the first installment of the Silly Symphonies series. As a cartoon, the skeleton dance both perfectly encapsulates the grim, macabre imagery of Halloween, while also celebrating the spectacle of it all. The music is also incredibly fitting, using what Stalin once described as a quote-unquote foxtrot in a minor key. Given what he said about the short being inspired by vaudeville performance, this checks out. Another interesting part of the music is that it seems like Stalin referenced the composer Edvard Grieg in the music, specifically interpolating part of March of the Trolls from his lyric suite. Despite this though, Stalin denied using Grieg references in an interview with Funny World magazine. But the reason for that could also be that the interviewer asked about the wrong piece of music. Despite these assertions, many misinterpret the short's relationship to Danse macabre as an indication that its music is derived from the Saint-Saëns piece Danse macabre, but this is false. Though it had a rocky beginning, the skeleton dance has since become a remarkably influential animated short in the US American industry. Though animator Ub Iwerks would attempt to recreate his work with his post-Disney 1937 short Skeleton Frolic, the original 1929 film was the one that stayed in the cultural consciousness. The popularity of the song Spooky Scary Skeletons as a meme format shows that the idea of dancing skeletons still appeals to mainstream audiences. Though the song itself has little to do with the Disney short, the link between the two possibly began when Disney used the song alongside clips of the skeleton dance in a 1998 sing-along VHS release. Even if it wasn't intentional, the skeleton dance fits well within the tradition of the Danse macabre. The macabre imagery of skeletons is undercut by dancing in a graveyard to a foxtrot, highlighting both the inevitability and absurdity of death. Though it feels like the insight behind Danse macabre is lost when it's essentially memed into pop culture, one of the most beautifully poetic things about Danse macabre imagery is that it's just one example of taking something that's often viewed as an ending and making it part of the narrative of life. Just like the skeletons dancing in the graveyard, perhaps it's more complicated than just saying that life leads to death. Maybe the real takeaway is that death leads to life, with the limitation of mortality pushing us to embrace the moment and allow ourselves to have fun with it. Because, like the Murakami quote I mentioned earlier, death exists, not as the opposite, but as a part of life. So, let's dance. Oh, that skeleton rag, that goblin drag. It sounds so weepy, creepy, solemn, serious. See them wiggle and wag, singing, we are dead ones come to life. Hooray, 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 hooray. Oh, that skeleton rag, they swell it and brag about their epitaphs with laughs delirious at some ghostly gag in that moany, groany, bony skeleton rap.